A single knock of a gavel could seal a person's fate for centuries. We have all heard of the Spanish Inquisition, but its true story remains one of history's greatest deceptions. It was not merely a religious court. It was a sprawling, 350-year operation built on hidden ambitions far beyond faith. This investigation will expose the secret political schemes and financial motives that truly powered this infamous institution. Why did the Spanish crown create a system that openly defied the Pope himself? How did the fear of neighbors turn into a highly profitable state enterprise? You are about to see the Spanish Inquisition stripped of its myths, revealing the cold machinery of control that lurked beneath. When you think of absolute power, what does it truly look like? The official decree echoed through town squares across Spain, promising a singular purpose: the purification of the faith. With the final defeat of the Muslim Kingdom of Granada in 1492, the monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella had achieved a monumental feat: the political unification of Spain. Yet for their new kingdom to stand strong, they believed it needed one faith, one creed, one absolute truth. The Spanish Inquisition was presented as the divine instrument for this holy work, a necessary guardian of Catholic orthodoxy. Its primary focus fell upon two groups, the conversos and the Moriscos. These were Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity, thousands of whom had embraced the new religion, some by genuine conviction, others under immense social pressure. The official story claimed that many were secretly practicing their old religions behind closed doors, a hidden betrayal that threatened the very soul of the nation. The Inquisition's mission, so the public was told, was to root out these false believers, to ensure every soul in Spain was genuinely Catholic. This noble, public-facing goal provided a powerful and righteous justification. But behind this banner of religious purity, other, far more earthly ambitions were already taking root. Why would a state go to such extremes, creating an entire legal system outside the normal courts just to police private belief? The answer begins to unravel when you look at who the first and most persistent targets truly were. Yet the target was chosen with a precision that reveals a deeper strategy. The conversos were not merely a spiritual concern. They were often among the most educated, successful, and well-connected people in the kingdom. Many had risen to prominent positions in finance, medicine, and government. By focusing the Inquisition's immense power on this particular group, the crown was not just policing belief, it was systematically dismantling a rival power base. A wealthy converso merchant could have his property confiscated by the state the moment he was accused. His social standing offered no protection against a charge of secret Judaism. In fact, his success might even make him a more tempting target. This was not random persecution. It was a calculated move to break the influence of a class that could challenge the monarchy's absolute authority. The immense wealth seized from those accused did not go to the church in Rome. It flowed directly into the royal treasury, funding the crown's ambitious projects and wars. So the first and most crucial hidden agenda comes into sharp focus. The Spanish Inquisition was a masterful tool for centralizing royal power. For centuries, a king's power in Europe was checked by a complex web of forces. Local nobles ruled their own lands with their own armies. The church operated its own courts and answered to the Pope in Rome. Ferdinand and Isabella envisioned something new, a unified Spain where their word was the final law. The Inquisition was the revolutionary instrument that made this possible. It was a state-controlled agency answerable directly to the crown, not to the Vatican. This was an unprecedented power grab. Inquisitors were royal agents operating outside the traditional feudal and church structures. They could travel to any town, summon any person, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, and demand answers. Their authority undermined local bishops who found their own influence over spiritual matters suddenly sidelined. It intimidated powerful dukes and counts who could no longer guarantee protection for the people on their own land. If the Inquisition came for a noble's most trusted advisor or richest banker, there was little the noble could do. The monarchy had effectively made itself the ultimate arbiter of both faith and order. Think of the sheer psychological control this created. Your loyalty was no longer just to your local lord or even to the distant pope. Your primary allegiance was demanded by the crown, enforced by a terrifying court that could question the most private aspects of your life. This was the genius of their plan. By wrapping themselves in the cloak of religious purity, Ferdinand and Isabella built a machinery of control that reached into the very hearts and minds of their subjects, making the Spanish throne more powerful than any before it. But this power extended far beyond the courtroom. The Inquisition's true genius lay in its transformation into a sprawling spy network, a state-funded intelligence agency that reached into every village and every home. It cultivated a culture of denunciation where suspicion became a civic duty. Neighbors were encouraged, even pressured, to report on one another. A whispered prayer, a strange dietary habit, a missed mass, any small deviation could be reported to the inquisitors. This system turned the entire population into unwitting agents of the crown, creating a society where trust was a liability and fear was the true ruler. The records kept by the Inquisition became its most potent weapon. Every testimony, every accusation, every financial record and family connection was meticulously documented. This created an unprecedented database on the entire population, a detailed map of wealth, alliances, and potential descent. If a noble family was growing too powerful, the crown could consult these files to find a convenient heresy charge. If a region showed signs of rebellion, the Inquisition's local network could identify and intimidate the ringleaders before any plot could form. This was a mechanism of control so advanced it feels chillingly modern. The state now possessed a file on its most influential subjects, a weapon of social control that could be deployed at any moment. How do you govern a restless kingdom? You ensure that the walls themselves have ears. Yet the machinery of fear required immense resources to operate. A permanent state of surveillance and prosecution is not cheap, and here we uncover the Inquisition's second, deeply cynical agenda. It was engineered to pay for itself and then some through a system of institutionalized plunder. The moment a person was accused of heresy, their property could be seized by the state. This confiscation often happened immediately after the accusation, long before any trial or verdict. Imagine the chilling reality. A wealthy merchant, a respected doctor, or a successful banker is taken from their home in the night. Before the sun even rises, royal officials are inventorying their belongings, freezing their accounts, and sealing their warehouses. Their family is left with nothing, their life's work liquidated to fund the very institution that has destroyed them. The financial incentive for the crown was immediate and enormous. This was not a byproduct of the system, it was the system's fuel. The Inquisition did not need to beg Parliament for funds or raise taxes on a reluctant populace. It generated its own revenue stream directly from the persecution of its targets. And who were the most lucrative targets? The conversos, the very same group whose influence the crown sought to break. Many of these families had built substantial fortunes in trade, finance, and skilled professions. They represented a vast reservoir of capital, and the Inquisition became the pipe that diverted that wealth straight into the royal treasury. A single high-profile case could finance the entire operation of a regional tribunal for a year. This transformed religious persecution into a highly profitable state enterprise. The pursuit of heretics became intertwined with the pursuit of profit, creating a terrible, self-perpetuating cycle. The more people the Inquisition arrested and convicted, the richer it became, and the more power it had to arrest even more people. Religious purification was the public justification, but the secret driving engine was cold, calculated economic exploitation. So we must ask, when a state profits directly from the destruction of its own citizens, where does justice end and greed begin? This process of confiscation was formalized through a chillingly bureaucratic procedure known as reconciliation. When an accused person was found guilty, they were often given a path to be welcomed back into the church. But this forgiveness came at a steep price. Reconciliation was not merely a spiritual act, it was a financial transaction. The penitent was required to pay substantial fines and, most devastatingly, to formally surrender all rights to their confiscated property. This legal mechanism transformed plunder into policy, dressing raw seizure in the robes of divine forgiveness. A family's entire inheritance could be legally erased with a single signature, all under the guise of religious penitence. This river of wealth did not simply fill the Inquisition's own coffers to pay for its judges and scribes. It flowed directly into the royal treasury, becoming a primary engine for the most ambitious projects of the Spanish Empire. The very gold and silver stripped from homes in Seville and Barcelona helped fund the armies fighting in Italy and the Netherlands. It paid for the vast galleons that sailed across the Atlantic. The terror cultivated in a small Spanish town was directly connected to the conquest of a new world. Think of the profound irony. The persecution of one group of people, accused of secret beliefs, provided the capital that allowed Spain to impose its faith and authority across oceans and continents. This was the ultimate monetization of fear. The system was so effective, so profitable, that it begs a disturbing question. Was the survival of the Inquisition for 3.5 centuries due more to its religious fervor or to its impeccable function as a financial institution? The financial incentives and the culture of fear worked in perfect harmony, but the ultimate goal was even more ambitious. The Inquisition was not merely extracting wealth or enforcing belief. It was systematically redesigning Spanish society itself. This third hidden agenda aimed to forge a new national identity, one defined not just by faith but by blood. This is where the notorious concept of purity of blood entered the stage. Statutes known as limpieza de sangre began to spread across institutions. These were not mere social prejudices. They were legally binding codes that created a rigid, hereditary caste system. Your value to the kingdom was no longer determined by your personal devotion or your professional skills. It was judged by the ancestry of your grandparents. If you had a Jewish or Muslim forebear, even one who had converted generations earlier, you were legally tainted. Your blood was considered impure. The consequences were devastating and absolute. A brilliant student with the wrong family history could be barred from attending a university. A skilled and courageous soldier could be denied entry into the prestigious military orders, the very pathway to honor and high command. Professions in law, medicine, and government slowly closed their doors. This system effectively created a permanent underclass based on lineage, a wall that no amount of personal merit or genuine faith could ever breach. So why would a state intentionally cripple its own talent pool? The answer lies in the power of a unified identity. By defining Spanishness in these new racial terms, the Crown created a powerful tool for social control. It gave so-called old Christians, those with no known Jewish or Muslim ancestors, a privileged status to protect. Their loyalty to the Crown was secured because the system that privileged them was the same system that gave the monarchy its absolute power. It turned neighbor against neighbor in a new way, not just over suspicion of secret prayers, but over the unchangeable facts of genealogy. This was social engineering on a grand scale, an attempt to wipe the slate clean and build a homogeneous nation utterly loyal to the throne. The tragedy of this agenda is that its legacy did not end when the Inquisition itself was finally disbanded. The idea that a nation could be defined by racial purity, a concept forged in 16th century Spain, would echo through the centuries with terrible consequences. How does an idea born in a royal court become a poison that lingers for generations? This obsession with blood purity did more than just close doors. It burrowed deep into the Spanish psyche, creating a society governed by a new and pervasive kind of fear. The terror was no longer just about being accused by a neighbor. It became a private, internal battle where you had to police your own thoughts and your own family's past. People began to self-censor not only their words but their very memories, performing a rigid, hyper-vigilant form of Catholicism to prove their loyalty. Every gesture in church, every meal prepared, every holiday observed was now a potential piece of evidence in a trial that could begin at any moment. This was the ultimate success of the Inquisition's social engineering. It made the state's goals the individual's personal responsibility. The walls did not just have ears. Your own conscience became the primary informant. To survive in this world, families were forced to become accomplices in their own historical erasure. Imagine the heartbreaking scenes that must have played out in quiet homes across the country. A family Bible with notes written in Hebrew, passed down for generations, would be fed into the fireplace. A grandmother's recipe for a dish traditionally served during a Muslim holiday was forgotten on purpose. Letters, heirlooms, any tangible connection to a Jewish or Muslim ancestor was systematically destroyed. People were literally burning their own histories to ashes to fabricate a new, acceptable lineage. They had to prove their limpieza de sangre, and the only way to do that was to eliminate any proof to the contrary. This created a national trauma, a severed connection to the past that left a void filled with anxiety and shame. Who were you if you had to destroy the story of where you came from? The result was a culture of profound conformity that stifled Spain for centuries. When the cost of being different is the complete ruin of your family and the loss of everything you own, innovation becomes a dangerous gamble. Why question established ideas when curiosity itself could be labeled as heretical? Why explore new forms of art or science if the patron supporting you might be accused tomorrow, leaving you without an income? Intellectual and cultural life entered a long, slow frost. The vibrant exchange of ideas that had once flourished in medieval Spain, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked side by side, was not just a memory. It was now a dangerous concept, a ghost to be feared. The Inquisition did not just control what people did, it successfully narrowed what they could even dare to think about. The institution's most enduring legacy was not the fear it inflicted in public squares, but the silence it cultivated in the human mind. What happens to a nation when its brightest minds are taught that the greatest virtue is to not be noticed? This intellectual quarantine was enforced with brutal efficiency through a notorious instrument of control, the Index of Forbidden Books. Imagine a list so vast it could dictate what an entire nation was permitted to read, to learn, and to think. The Spanish Inquisition compiled exactly that. This was not a simple list of heretical religious texts. It was a comprehensive blacklist that banned thousands of books on subjects ranging from astronomy and medicine to poetry and political philosophy. Any work that challenged the absolute authority of the Church or the Crown was systematically targeted. The writings of Erasmus, a great European humanist, were banned for their critiques of the Church. Scientific works by Copernicus and others were prohibited for suggesting the Earth was not the center of the universe. This censorship was not an accidental byproduct of religious zeal. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy to build a wall around the Spanish mind. The goal was to prevent the population from being exposed to Protestant ideas from the north or the emerging seeds of Enlightenment thought from France. Why was this so critical to the state's power? Because a new idea is the most dangerous contagion an absolute authority can face. A person who reads about a different form of government might start to question their own king. A person who learns about scientific discoveries that contradict church doctrine might start to doubt the priests. The Inquisition understood that to control a population completely, you must first control the very information it can access. This was a form of mind control more sophisticated than any torture chamber. It was an attack on the future itself, ensuring that the next generation of thinkers, scientists, and leaders would be raised in an intellectual desert, starved of any competing worldviews. The message was clear: curiosity was a crime, and knowledge was its own kind of heresy. How do you stop a revolution before it even begins? You make sure no one can read about one. The long shadow of the Index fell directly upon the minds of Spain's greatest thinkers, creating a silence where discovery should have flourished. This chilling effect meant that a scientist peering through a telescope at the moons of Jupiter had to ask himself a terrifying question before publishing his findings. Was this new truth a heresy? Would it contradict a doctrine he was required to believe? The risk was not just to his career, but to his life. Prominent intellectuals faced direct persecution. A brilliant doctor and humanist named Miguel Cervito, for instance, discovered the pulmonary circulation of blood, a monumental medical breakthrough. Yet his unorthodox religious views led him to be hunted across Europe, ultimately captured and condemned by the Inquisition, which burned him at the stake. His scientific genius could not save him. The message was received loud and clear by every scholar in the kingdom. To question the natural world was to risk questioning divine authority, and that was a line you crossed only once. As a result, Spain, which had been a vibrant center of learning, fell generations behind nations like England and the Netherlands, where scientific inquiry was beginning to bloom without such deadly constraints. The cost of this intellectual freeze was incalculable. How many cures for diseases, how many understandings of the universe were lost in that climate of fear? Even the world of art and literature was not safe from this oppressive atmosphere. Writers and painters had to become masters of code, embedding their social critiques so deeply within their work that they could fly just below the radar of the inquisitors. The greatest example of this is Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote. On the surface, his masterpiece is a hilarious adventure about a deluded old knight. But read between the lines, and it becomes a profound satire of Spanish society itself. Cervantes uses the madness of his hero to question the very ideals of chivalry and honor that the state held so dear. He fills his book with characters who are persecuted or on the run, from Moriscos being expelled to criminals avoiding the law, holding up a mirror to the injustices of his time. He had to be careful, of course. Cervantes himself had his own run-ins with the royal treasury and understood the perils of speaking too plainly. His genius was in using allegory as a shield, allowing him to say what others could not. He created a world so rich and entertaining that the authorities might have missed the dangerous ideas hidden within its pages. This was the delicate dance of the Spanish artist. Your work had to be brilliant enough to be celebrated, but coded enough to avoid being condemned. You had to make your critique with a wink and a nod, trusting your audience to understand the truth you dared not state outright. The ultimate legacy of this centuries-long suppression was a nation stripped of its intellectual momentum. While France was nurturing philosophers who would inspire a revolution, and England was fostering scientists who would unlock the laws of physics, Spain was teaching its brightest minds to look inward in suspicion, not outward in wonder. The focus shifted from discovering new truths to endlessly policing old orthodoxies. This is the profound, long-term cost of placing control over curiosity. A culture that cannot freely question, that cannot safely imagine alternatives, is a culture destined to stagnate. It becomes a museum of its own past, unable to build a new future. The story of the Spanish Inquisition, then, is not just a tale of religious persecution or political power. It is a cautionary tale about what happens to any society that decides it is safer to burn a book than to read it. The very design of the Inquisition invited a more personal, insidious form of corruption. Its reliance on secret denunciations and anonymous testimony created a perfect weapon for anyone with a grudge to settle. The terrifying power of the state could be rented for the price of a whisper. a business rival growing too successful, a neighbor in a property dispute, a political opponent gaining influence, all could be neutralized with a single, unverified letter dropped into the inquisitor's box. The accusation itself was often enough to trigger arrest, confiscation of property, and social ruin long before any verdict was reached. This was justice turned into a marketplace for vengeance. One of the most dramatic examples involved a man named Bartolomé de Carranza, the Archbishop of Toledo. He was the highest-ranking churchman in Spain, a respected theologian who had even served as a consultant to the Council of Trent. His downfall began not because of any genuine heresy, but because he had powerful enemies, rivals within the Spanish church, jealous of his influence and his closeness to the royal family, orchestrated a campaign of secret accusations against him. They alleged his writings contained Protestant-leaning ideas. For 17 years, Carranza was embroiled in a legal nightmare, shuffled between prisons, his authority and reputation destroyed long before he was finally given a light sentence. His case was not about faith, it was a political assassination using the Inquisition as its blade. Even the highest officers offered no protection when the system itself was the weapon. Consider the chilling fate of Juan de Egidio, the head of a prestigious Dominican college in Seville. He was a man of immense learning and respect until he fell afoul of the powerful Duke of Medina Sidonia. The Duke's motives were purely personal, a tangled web of slights and political maneuvering. Using his influence, the Duke ensured that damaging rumors about Egidio's orthodoxy reached the right ears. Egidio was arrested, subjected to a long and humiliating trial, and ultimately condemned. His real crime was not heresy, but crossing a noble who knew how to manipulate the levers of fear. These cases expose the ultimate hypocrisy of the system. An institution presented as the guardian of divine truth was routinely used for the most earthly and petty of conflicts. It became a sanctioned channel for envy, ambition, and hate, granting every citizen a nuclear option against their neighbors. This corruptibility may be its most haunting legacy. It demonstrates that when a society gives a small group of people absolute power over the lives of others, wrapped in the cloak of righteousness, that power will inevitably be used not just to control a population, but to let that population destroy itself. What does it say about an inquisition when the greatest heresy was often simply having an enemy with good connections? The case of Bartolomé de Carranza reveals the Inquisition's machinery at its most cynical. As the Archbishop of Toledo, he was the primate of all Spain, a man who had helped shape Catholic doctrine at the Council of Trent. He was, by any measure, a pillar of the church establishment. Yet in 1559, this same pillar found himself arrested by the Inquisition and charged with secretly promoting Lutheran ideas. The accusations were absurd on their face. How could the man helping to lead the Counter-Reformation be a hidden Protestant? The truth had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with envy. Carranza had risen too high, too fast, and he had made powerful enemies. His primary rival was a fellow theologian, Melchor Cano, a man seething with professional jealousy. Cano and his allies began a covert campaign, carefully combing through Carranza's published writings and private sermons, twisting his words to fabricate a case of heresy. They presented these distorted interpretations to the inquisitors, not to uncover truth, but to destroy a competitor. For 17 long years, Carranza's life became a legal purgatory. He was shuffled between prisons, his authority stripped, his reputation publicly shredded. The trial became an international spectacle, pulling in the Pope and King Philip II of Spain, both of whom were forced to navigate the political fallout. The Pope, furious that a Spanish court was judging one of his highest-ranking cardinals, repeatedly demanded the case be transferred to Rome. The Spanish crown, unwilling to cede an inch of its control over the Inquisition, stubbornly refused. Carranza himself was the pawn in this high-stakes power struggle between a king and a pope. He was finally given a light sentence in 1576, forced to abjectly renounce 16 vague propositions, but the damage was irreversible. He died just weeks after his release, a broken man. His real crime was never heresy. It was possessing a level of influence that others coveted. His case proves that when an institution is designed to operate on suspicion, even the most orthodox believer is not safe. If the Archbishop of Toledo could be brought down by a whisper, then who was truly secure? The Inquisition's machinery did not remain confined to Europe. As Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic carrying conquistadors and colonists, another, more subtle form of control sailed with them. The Tribunal of the Holy Office established its first American headquarters in Mexico City in 1571, followed soon after by another in Lima. Its official mission was the same, to guard the Catholic faith in the new lands, but in the sprawling, restive colonies, its true function became even more critical. It was the sharp edge of imperial control, a mechanism to ensure that loyalty to the Spanish crown remained absolute, thousands of miles from Madrid. The vast ocean was not just a barrier, it was a potential breeding ground for dissent and rebellion. The Inquisition became the crown's long-distance grip on its most valuable possessions. In the Americas, the targets of this surveillance expanded dramatically. The tribunals hunted for crypto-Jews among the colonists, yes, but they also turned their focus to a new threat: Protestant sailors, merchants, and pirates from rival European nations like England and Holland. Any foreigner caught spreading their faith was not just a heretic, they were an agent of a competing empire, and the Inquisition dealt with them as a political enemy. More systematically, the institution turned its gaze upon the indigenous population. New converts who were suspected of secretly practicing their native religions were pursued with vigor. A ceremony held in a remote village, a hidden idol, a prayer spoken in an old language, these were all treated as crimes against the state. Why was this so important? Because the Spanish Empire was built on a foundation of religious justification. The right to rule the New World was, in the Crown's view, divinely granted, contingent upon converting its people. Any rejection of the faith was therefore not just a spiritual failure, but a direct challenge to Spanish authority itself. The Inquisition in the Americas was the ultimate instrument of cultural domination, designed to systematically erase old identities and replace them with a monolithic loyalty to a distant king and a foreign god. It ensured that the wealth flowing from the silver mines of Potosi and the plantations of the Caribbean would continue to enrich Spain and not fuel a colony's dreams of independence. The question shifts from why the Inquisition existed to how far its shadow could truly reach. Could a single institution in Mexico City really dictate the conscience of an entire continent? The Inquisition's arrival in the Americas transformed faith into a tool of conquest. Indigenous spiritual leaders, the guardians of ancient knowledge and tradition, were systematically recast as agents of the devil. A shaman performing a healing ritual with sacred plants became a sorcerer consorting with dark forces. A community gathering to honor an ancestral spirit was redefined as a demonic pact. This deliberate relabeling was not just slander, it was legal strategy. By framing native practices as witchcraft and idolatry, the Inquisition provided a moral and legal pretext for their violent eradication. It justified the unforgivable, turning the protection of a people's soul into the method for its destruction. What does it mean when your God is declared a demon and your prayers are treated as crimes? The prosecution of idolatry became a primary focus for the colonial tribunals. Inquisitors organized visits of inspection, sending priests and soldiers into villages to root out hidden religious objects. They conducted mass interrogations, pressuring individuals to reveal the locations of sacred sites. When a hidden idol was discovered, the consequences were ceremonial and severe. The object was publicly paraded, denounced, and then destroyed, often burned in a great auto de fe or act of faith. These were spectacles of power designed to terrorize the population into submission. The message was unequivocal. The old gods were not just false, they were defeated, and any loyalty to them would be met with fire and ruin. But the assault extended beyond physical objects to the very memory of a culture. The most devastating losses were often the written records. Spanish friars and Inquisition officials systematically sought out and destroyed native codices, the beautifully illustrated books that held the history, calendars, mythology, and scientific knowledge of entire civilizations. In a single bonfire, centuries of astronomical observations, medical knowledge, and literary tradition could be reduced to ash. This was more than censorship, it was intellectual annihilation. They were not merely burning paper, they were burning a people's connection to their own past, ensuring that future generations would have no way to reclaim what had been lost. The great temples and pyramids suffered a similar fate, not just torn down, but often quarried for the stones to build Catholic churches directly on top of their foundations. This physical superimposition was a powerful, daily reminder of who now held dominion, both on the land and in the heavens. This systematic dismantling of indigenous identity was not a byproduct of colonial zeal. It was a cold, calculated necessity for the empire's ultimate goal, resource extraction. A people stripped of their culture, their leaders, and their history are far easier to control and exploit. A man who believes his gods have abandoned him is more likely to submit to a life of forced labor in a silver mine. A community that has lost its shared stories is less likely to unite in rebellion. The Inquisition, in this light, was not a side project. It was the sharpened tip of the colonial spear, softening up the cultural landscape so that the economic machinery of the empire could operate without resistance. The forced conversion of millions was the prerequisite for their forced servitude. The gold and silver that built palaces in Madrid were mined not just from the mountains of Peru, but from the shattered spirit of its people. This is the final, terrible equation of the Spanish Inquisition. It discovered that the most profitable resource to extract was not silver or gold, but the human soul itself. Yet the story we have inherited is not a simple one. For centuries, the Spanish Inquisition has been viewed through another powerful lens, a propaganda campaign known as the Black Legend or La Leyenda Negra. This was not a Spanish creation. It was a narrative weapon forged by Spain's European rivals, particularly England and the Netherlands, who were locked in fierce political and religious wars with the Spanish Empire. Their pamphlets and books were filled with gruesome, often exaggerated accounts of inquisitorial torture and autos da fe, painting Spain as a nation uniquely monstrous and barbaric. The goal was to demonize their enemy, to turn international opinion against the Spanish crown, and to justify their own imperial ambitions. It was a masterclass in information warfare where the truth was the first casualty. So we must confront a difficult duality. The Inquisition was a real and terrible institution, but its historical reputation was also shaped by those who had every reason to make it seem even worse. This does not excuse its actions, but it complicates our understanding. The Black Legend focused a harsh, singular light on Spanish cruelty, while conveniently ignoring the beams in its own eye. Across Europe, in the very nations decrying the Inquisition, similar persecutions were unfolding. In England, Queen Mary Tudor earned her own bloody nickname for burning nearly 300 Protestants at the stake. In Geneva, under John Calvin, a man was executed for his unorthodox religious views. The French monarchy was responsible for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a horrific slaughter of thousands of French Protestants. Religious violence was tragically a pan-European disease, not a uniquely Spanish sin. The genius of the Black Legend was its selectivity. It took a real horror and amplified it into a national caricature, using the Inquisition as proof of Spain's inherent backwardness and tyranny. This propaganda was incredibly effective, shaping perceptions of Spain for centuries and even influencing how history itself was written. The question this leaves us with is profound. How do we separate the real crimes of an institution from the myths that its enemies crafted? The Black Legend reminds us that history is never just a record of what happened. It is also a story told by the victors and sometimes by the most skilled propagandists. The Black Legend served a political purpose, but the truth of the Inquisition remained locked away for centuries. A real reckoning could only begin when the doors to its own secret archives were finally thrown open. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as modern Spain evolved, the vast records of the Holy Office were transferred from dusty basements to national archives, becoming accessible to historians. For the first time, researchers could bypass the propaganda and read the institution's own internal paperwork, the millions of trial records, financial ledgers, and internal correspondence. This was not a matter of interpretation, it was a confrontation with the raw data of power. What they discovered within those pages forced a dramatic and uncomfortable revision of the Inquisition's history. The most shocking revelation for the public was perhaps the scale of the killing. The archives revealed that the number of people executed by the Spanish Inquisition was significantly lower than the hundreds of thousands often cited in Protestant pamphlets. Modern scholarly estimates based on these meticulous records suggest a figure closer to 3,000 to 5,000 people over its entire 3.5-century lifespan. Now, this number is still a horrific tally of lives brutally ended. Each one represents a profound tragedy, but the shift in scale is critical, not to minimize the suffering, but to understand the institution's true nature. It was not a frenzied killing machine running amok. It was something far more calculating, a bureaucratic entity that valued control through terror and spectacle, but did not necessarily require constant bloodshed to achieve it. The auto da fe was its primary theater, a public drama designed to demonstrate the consequences of defiance, and the archives show that many more people were subjected to humiliating public penance or lengthy imprisonments than were ever handed over to the secular authorities for execution. This bureaucratic soul is further revealed in the strict, almost obsessive legal procedures the Inquisition followed. The institution presented itself as a court, and its legitimacy depended on maintaining that facade. The accused, known as the defendant, had certain rights. They could, for instance, present a list of their personal enemies to the tribunal. If an accuser was found to be on that list, their testimony could be thrown out as motivated by vendetta. The trial records are filled with these tackers, as they were called, showing that some defendants actively and successfully used this procedural loophole to dismantle the case against them. The inquisitors themselves were often university-trained lawyers, bound by a complex rulebook that dictated every step of the process, from the initial accusation to the final sentencing. This legalism does not make the Inquisition any less terrifying. In fact, it makes it more so. Its horror was not born from chaotic violence, but from a cold, systematic, and state-sanctioned process that could meticulously document your destruction while pretending to protect your soul. The real question this evidence forces us to ask is not about the number of deaths, but about the quality of the fear. Which is more paralyzing, a sudden outburst of mob violence, or the slow, inexorable grind of a legal machine that has already decided your guilt? Its meticulous paperwork reveals the Inquisition's true nature. This was not a chaotic mob, but a sprawling bureaucracy whose primary product was fear. The entire terrifying experience, from a neighbor's whisper to a final verdict, was governed by a strict written procedure. The process always began with an edict of grace, a public announcement read in churches. This offered a period for people to come forward and confess their own heresies voluntarily, with the promise of lighter penance. It was a clever first move, designed to make people incriminate themselves and their families before any formal accusation was even made. Once that grace period ended, the real engine of the system kicked into gear: the denunciation. Anyone could denounce anyone else, and they were actively encouraged to do so. The accusations were collected in special boxes placed in churches, and the identity of the accuser was kept secret from the accused. This single rule shattered the foundation of community trust, turning every relationship into a potential threat. Once a denunciation was deemed credible, the case moved to the fiscal or prosecutor. He would evaluate the evidence and, if he found grounds, formally draw up the accusation. Then the accused person, now called the defendant, was arrested without warning. Their property was immediately inventoried and seized, a financial transaction that began the moment the cell door locked. The defendant was then brought before the inquisitors, who were not wild-eyed fanatics but typically university-educated lawyers and theologians. They were administrators of terror following a detailed legal manual. The charges were read, but the defendant was not told who had accused them or what specific evidence existed. This was a key tactic, leaving the person in a state of profound disorientation, forced to guess the source of the threat. They were, however, given one crucial procedural right. They could provide a list of their known personal enemies. If the secret accuser's name appeared on that list, their testimony might be thrown out. This was the system's cold nod to legality, a tiny loophole in a process designed for conviction. At the heart of this legal theater was the interrogation. The goal was always the same, a full confession. Inquisitors believed that confession was not just evidence but necessary for the salvation of the soul. To obtain it, they were legally permitted to use torture. This was not random sadism. It was a codified, supervised procedure. The rules were precise. Torture could only be applied once, though that session could be suspended and continued over several days. A doctor had to be present to ensure the subject did not die, and a notary was required to meticulously document every question, every answer, and every scream. The most common method was the strappado, where the prisoner's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air by a rope, dislocating their shoulders. The entire gruesome spectacle was treated as a bureaucratic formality, another box to check on the path to a confession. Any confession obtained under torture had to be voluntarily reaffirmed by the prisoner at least a full day later, otherwise it was considered invalid. This created a terrible paradox where a person broken by pain was expected to later confirm their own destruction while in a state of rational calm. Throughout this entire ordeal, the notary was the silent, constant witness. His job was to create the official record, the paper trail that gave the entire process an air of legitimacy. He documented everything from the initial denunciation to the final sigh of a confession. This mountain of paperwork was the system's memory and its shield. It allowed the inquisitors to present themselves not as persecutors, but as impartial judges following the letter of the law. The final act was the auto de fe, or act of faith. This was a massive public spectacle, a carefully choreographed ceremony where the sentences were read. Those who had confessed and reconciled with the church might be sentenced to wear a penitential garment called a San Benito or face imprisonment. Those deemed unrepentant were handed over to the secular authorities for execution, almost always by burning. The auto de fe was the ultimate piece of bureaucratic theater, a public demonstration that the system worked, that order was maintained, and that the state's power was absolute. Its terrifying efficiency did not lie in how many people it killed, but in how thoroughly it documented every step of their ruin. What does it say when horror becomes a matter of routine paperwork? The auto da fe was a production of terror, meticulously staged from dawn until dusk. It began not with an execution, but with a somber, colorful procession. The condemned, known as the penitents, were led through the crowded streets dressed in distinctive tunics called San Benitos. These were not simple prisoner uniforms. They were elaborate yellow garments often painted with flames and dragons, a public billboard announcing the wearer's supposed sins. Some San Benitos depicted the prisoner burning at the stake, a permanent, humiliating prophecy. Others showed them fleeing the flames, a symbol of a last-minute repentance. Every stitch and symbol was designed to brand the individual, to turn a human being into a walking cautionary tale for all to see. The procession moved slowly, allowing the crowd to absorb every detail, to recognize their neighbor now transformed into a public spectacle. This was psychological warfare woven into fabric. The ceremony itself was held in the city's largest plaza, a space temporarily converted into a massive open-air theater. Elaborate grandstands were erected for the nobility and clergy, ensuring the social hierarchy was on full display. The inquisitors and royal officials occupied the most prominent positions, their elevated seats a physical manifestation of their absolute authority. The common people packed the square below, a captive audience for a performance where the stakes were life and death. The event could last for hours, even an entire day, filled with long sermons, prayers, and the solemn reading of each sentence. The air was thick with incense and anticipation, a bizarre mix of the sacred and the morbid. This drawn-out ritual was not an inefficiency, it was the entire point. The goal was to stretch the tension, to make the crowd internalize the lesson that defiance led to this slow, public unraveling. The climax of the spectacle was the reading of the final sentences. Those who had confessed and reconciled with the church might be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment or forced to wear their San Benito for the rest of their life, a permanent social outcast. But those deemed unrepentant were handed over to the secular authorities. The phrase used was always the same, a chilling piece of legal fiction, that the church relinquished the condemned to the secular arm and begged that it deal with them mercifully and without bloodshed. Everyone knew this was a hollow formality. The state's mercy was the torch. The prisoners were then led away, often to a field outside the city called the Quemadero, the burning place. There, the fires were lit. The crowd did not just witness an execution. They participated in a collective act of judgment. By attending, by watching, by not looking away, they became complicit in the state's power. The shared experience of fear and condemnation created a twisted form of social unity. In that plaza, differences of class or background momentarily faded, replaced by a common identity, those who were orthodox watching those who were not. It was a powerful tool for cementing loyalty, making the populace partners in their own subjugation. This grotesque public entertainment served a dual purpose. It terrorized people into compliance, yes, but it also gave them a sanctioned outlet for their own anxieties and aggressions. In a life full of hardship, the auto da fe offered a day of drama and a clear, simple narrative where good triumphed over evil and order was restored. The real horror lies in understanding how effectively a state can use spectacle not just to punish the few, but to control the minds of the many. What does it do to a society when its most unifying public event is a ceremony of human suffering? But the Inquisition's obsession with control did not stop at grand heresy or political conspiracy. Its long fingers reached into the most intimate corners of daily life, policing superstition, morality, and even personal taste. In small villages, the tribunal frequently pursued women accused of witchcraft. These were rarely the dramatic Sabbaths of legend, but cases rooted in local gossip and misfortune. An old woman known for healing with herbs might be accused of casting the evil eye after a neighbor's child fell ill. A spurned lover might be denounced for using love magic, perhaps by placing a charm under a man's doorstep to bend his will. The Inquisition became the arbiter of these personal feuds and fears, turning a folk healer into a state-level enemy. Their interest was not always to burn the accused, but to impose an official, orthodox version of reality where only priestly blessings held power, not a village-wise woman's potions. This was control at the most granular level, an attempt to standardize the supernatural itself. How do you dictate what people are allowed to fear? Even within the convents, the Inquisition found work. It closely monitored nuns who claimed to have divine visions and mystical experiences. A sister who reported speaking directly with Christ or the Virgin Mary could attract a devoted following, and with it, a dangerous degree of influence. The inquisitors would descend to investigate, questioning her relentlessly. Was her ecstasy a genuine gift from God, or a demonic deception born of pride or even mental illness? The line between saint and heretic was terrifyingly thin, and the state was determined to be the one who drew it. No aspect of life was too trivial for their notice. In one particularly absurd case, a man was formally tried for blasphemy. His crime: he stood before a church painting of a saint and loudly declared that the artwork was hideously ugly. To the Inquisition, this was not a simple matter of poor artistic taste. It was an insult to the sacred image itself, a disruption of the public reverence the state demanded. These bizarre and unexpected trials reveal the institution's ultimate ambition. It was not content with governing faith. It sought to legislate emotion, to criminalize personal opinion, and to sanitize the human imagination until every thought conformed to a state-approved template. When an institution tries a man for insulting a painting, it is no longer defending a doctrine. It is attempting to police the soul itself. The archives of terror also hold quiet stories of defiance. For every person broken by the Inquisition, another found a way to fight back, weaving resistance into the very fabric of a system designed to crush it. This was not always a dramatic public rebellion. It was a subtle, underground war of wits fought in the shadows of the bureaucracy itself. One of the most powerful forms of resistance was the creation of secret escape networks. Sympathetic individuals, sometimes even from within the church, established covert routes to help the accused flee Spain. A merchant might hide a family in a cargo shipment bound for Italy. A ship's captain, paid from a hidden family fortune, could provide passage to the more tolerant Ottoman Empire or the Netherlands. These networks operated in absolute secrecy, a silent testament to the humanity that persisted even under the boot of absolute power. They proved that the Inquisition's grip was not quite as total as it seemed. There were always cracks in the wall, and people were always willing to help others slip through. How many lives were saved by a whispered warning or a door left unlocked in the dead of night? Within the legal maze of the Inquisition itself, a small, brave group of men found another way to resist. These were the defense lawyers. They were few in number and operated under severe constraints, forbidden from challenging the fundamental authority of the tribunal. Yet, some used their knowledge of the Inquisition's own complex procedures to mount surprisingly effective defenses. Their primary weapon was a procedural tactic known as the taca. As we've seen, a defendant had the right to submit a list of their known enemies. A skilled lawyer would work with the accused to create the most comprehensive list possible, naming every business rival, every disgruntled former servant, every neighbor with a grudge. If the anonymous accuser was identified as being on that list, their testimony could be thrown out. This turned the system's obsession with secret denunciations against itself. A case built on whispers could collapse if a single whisper was traced back to a personal vendetta. These lawyers were not arguing for religious freedom. They were fighting on the Inquisition's own terms, using its rulebook to save lives. They understood that the most effective resistance sometimes looks like perfect compliance, while subtly steering the machinery toward a failure. Outside the courtroom, an entire shadow economy emerged to combat the tyranny of blood. The limpieza de sangre statutes created a desperate demand for a new product, a respectable past. A thriving underground industry of forgers specialized in creating flawless genealogical documents. For a hefty price, a converso family could purchase a new history, complete with fabricated baptismal records from a distant parish and a family tree stretching back to heroic old Christian knights. These forgeries had to be perfect, mimicking the right paper, the right ink, and the right official seals. A single mistake could mean discovery and ruin. This was a profound act of subversion. The state had created a system that judged people by their ancestry, so the people responded by inventing new ancestries. They were literally writing themselves back into society, using the state's own obsession with paperwork as their shield. What does it say about an institution when the people begin to forge their own reality in response? Even in the bleakest moments, people found ways to preserve their identity. Families developed intricate double lives, maintaining an outward performance of strict Catholicism while secretly observing their true faith in hidden rooms or cellars. They passed down traditions through coded stories and subtle symbols, a cultural heritage preserved not in writing but in memory and ritual. A certain way of lighting candles on a Friday night, a particular dish served during a specific season. These small, seemingly mundane acts became acts of quiet rebellion. They were a way of saying, you can take our property, you can threaten our lives, but you cannot have our souls. This spiritual resistance was perhaps the most enduring of all. It could not be confiscated like property or burned at the stake like a person. It lived on in the silent, stubborn hearts of a people who refused to be erased. The story of the Spanish Inquisition is not just a story of oppression. It is also a story of the unbreakable human spirit and the countless quiet ways it finds to endure. The echoes of the Inquisition did not fade with its official abolition in the 19th century. Its deepest legacy was not the trials themselves, but the cultural blueprint it had etched into the nation's soul, a template for control that would be resurrected in the 20th century. The culture of silence, suspicion, and enforced conformity became a potent political tool during the Spanish Civil War and the long dictatorship of Francisco Franco that followed. Franco's regime explicitly presented itself as a crusade to save a Catholic Spain from foreign, anti-clerical ideologies, consciously mirroring the Inquisition's old rhetoric of a nation under siege. The old machinery of denunciation returned as neighbors were again pressured to inform on one another for disloyalty to the state. The concept of limpieza, purity, was repurposed not against Jewish ancestry but against political dissent. Those on the losing side of the war were systematically purged from public life, their histories silenced, their very existence treated as a contamination of the national body. This was the Inquisition's modern incarnation, proving that the methods of absolutism are timeless. How does a ghost learn to wear a modern uniform? Today, Spain is engaged in a profound and painful national conversation about this very inheritance. The question of historical memory is not an academic exercise. It is a raw, living debate about exhumations of mass graves from the Civil War, about renaming streets, and about how to officially remember the victims of both the Inquisition and the Franco era. For decades, a Pacto del Olvido, a pact of forgetting, encouraged the nation to look away from its traumatic past in the name of moving forward. But silence does not heal wounds, it merely conceals them. The pressure to confront this history has led to formal apologies from an unexpected quarter. In the late 1990s, the Spanish Catholic Church issued a public apology for its historical failures, specifically acknowledging the harm caused by the Inquisition and asking for forgiveness. This was a monumental step, an institution finally grappling with its role in a system of terror. Yet for many, the question remains, can an apology ever be enough? The shadow of the Inquisition is longest not in official decrees, but in the subtle, inherited habits of a culture. Some sociologists point to a lingering distrust of public institutions and a reluctance to engage in communal activism, a possible remnant of centuries where organized groups outside the church and state were viewed with suspicion. The instinct to keep one's beliefs private to avoid drawing attention can be a ghost passed down through generations. Modern Spain is a vibrant, democratic, and diverse nation, but it is also a country still learning how to fully trust its own voice after centuries of being taught that the wrong word could lead to ruin. The real legacy of the Holy Office is not just in the history books, but in the quiet spaces between people, in the hesitation before a controversial opinion is shared, in the collective memory of what happens when a state decides it has a right to your soul. The greatest mystery the Spanish Inquisition leaves us with is not about its past, but about our own present. How do we recognize the architecture of control when it is built not with stone and gavel, but with silence and fear? Perhaps the most famous line about the Spanish Inquisition is that nobody expects it. This comes from a classic comedy sketch, a piece of brilliant absurdity that has shaped the modern image of the institution more than any history book. But while the sketch is hilarious, it has cemented a vision of bumbling, robed fanatics bursting into rooms with ridiculous torture devices. The reality was far more calculated and, in its own way, even more frightening. The men who ran the Inquisition were rarely wild-eyed monks. They were often university-trained lawyers and bureaucrats, administrators of fear who believed they were following a strict legal code. Their power came from paperwork and procedure, not from chaotic zeal. This professional class of inquisitors saw themselves as guardians of both faith and public order, operating a system they considered entirely legitimate and necessary. The difference between the myth of crazed fanatics and the reality of cold, educated lawyers changes everything about how we understand the Inquisition's 350-year reign. Which is more terrifying, an unpredictable mob or a predictable, soulless bureaucracy? Another powerful myth, heavily promoted by the Black Legend, is that Spain was constantly illuminated by the fires of burning heretics. The image of endless smoke rising from the Quemadero is seared into our collective memory. Yet the official records, the very documents the Inquisition itself kept, tell a more complex and nuanced story. Executions, while horrific and tragic, were not the most common outcome. The institution's primary tools were not the stake, but the prison cell, the heavy fine, and the public humiliation. For every person handed over to the secular authorities for execution, many more were sentenced to lengthy imprisonments, their property confiscated to fill the royal coffers. Others were forced to undergo public penance. They might be paraded through the streets wearing the infamous San Benito, that yellow tunic painted with flames, branding them as a sinner for the rest of their life. This garment was not just for the moment of the auto de fe. Some were required to wear it for years, a walking, daily reminder to their entire community of the price of nonconformity. The goal was less about annihilation and more about creating a lasting, visible monument to fear. Why kill a dissenter when you could make them a permanent advertisement for obedience? This is not to minimize the suffering or the brutality. A single execution is a profound evil, but understanding the real scale and methods is crucial. The Inquisition was a system of control that relied on a spectrum of punishments, with the ultimate penalty reserved as a dramatic, terrifying spectacle. The auto de fe was designed to be memorable, to burn itself into the public consciousness. This very spectacle, however, is what led to its exaggerated reputation. Foreign propagandists could point to these dramatic events and claim they were a weekly occurrence, when in reality, a large auto de fe was a major, infrequent event in any given city. The system's true genius was its economy of terror. It did not need to burn everyone. It just needed everyone to believe that they could be burned. The constant, low-grade fear of financial ruin, social ostracism, and indefinite imprisonment controlled far more people than the flames ever did. The myth of constant burning obscures the Inquisition's most insidious achievement, the creation of a society that policed itself. When the threat is always present but rarely seen, its power becomes absolute. Even from the highest throne in Christendom, the view of the Spanish Inquisition was one of deep alarm. The Vatican in Rome watched as this new tribunal, operating under the Spanish crown, amassed a terrifying degree of power. Several popes found themselves in a difficult position, caught between their spiritual authority and the raw political might of Ferdinand and Isabella. The Inquisition was not a project they had enthusiastically endorsed. In fact, it was a creation that often defied their direct commands. This complex struggle reveals a truth that dismantles a central myth. The Spanish Inquisition was not a unified arm of the Catholic Church. It was a state-run enterprise that frequently treated the Pope himself as a political obstacle. The conflict began almost immediately after the Inquisition was established. Pope Sixtus IV, who had signed the initial papal bull authorizing the tribunal, quickly grew horrified by the reports flooding in from Spain. He heard accounts of rampant abuses, of false testimony, and of confessions extracted under dubious circumstances. The zeal of the Spanish inquisitors was causing social chaos and, from the Pope's perspective, perverting the very idea of spiritual justice. In 1482, he took a bold stand. He issued a formal bull condemning the tribunal's methods and demanding major reforms. He insisted that the accused should have the right to legal counsel and that appeals should be allowed to go directly to Rome. This was a direct challenge to the Spanish crown's absolute control. Ferdinand and Isabella reacted not with obedience but with cold political fury. They saw the Pope's intervention as an unacceptable infringement on their royal sovereignty. They launched a diplomatic and political counter-assault, pressuring Sixtus IV with every tool at their disposal. They threatened to withdraw military support for papal interests in Italy. They mobilized their ambassadors and allies within the church hierarchy to lobby against the Pope's position. Faced with this overwhelming pressure from a united and powerful Spain, the Pope was forced to back down. He rescinded his own reforming bull, effectively surrendering control of the Inquisition to the Spanish monarchs. This single event set a precedent that would last for centuries. The Spanish Inquisition was answerable to the crown, not to the cross in Rome. Later popes continued to express their unease. Pope Alexander VI, for instance, tried to introduce more safeguards for those accused. Yet each time the Spanish monarchy pushed back, successfully defending what they considered their exclusive domain. The relationship was not one of partnership, but of a constant, quiet tug of war. The Spanish crown had created a holy office that operated outside the Holy See's direct control, a revolutionary power grab disguised as religious devotion. This agenda forces us to ask a startling question. What does it mean when the ultimate religious authority in the world is powerless to stop an institution acting in its name? The answer reveals that faith was often just the language being spoken, while the true conversation was always about power. The end came not with a bang, but with a slow, bureaucratic whimper. For 350 years, the Holy Office had seemed an immovable pillar of Spanish life, but by the dawn of the 19th century, the foundations were crumbling. The first major crack appeared from outside with the invasion of Napoleon's armies. French troops marched into Spain not just as conquerors, but as agents of a new revolutionary ideology. They saw the Inquisition as the very embodiment of the old, superstitious order they sought to dismantle. In 1808, the occupying government issued a decree formally abolishing the institution, branding it an obstacle to progress and a tool of tyranny. Though this was an edict imposed by a foreign power and would later be reversed, it was a devastating blow. For the first time, the unthinkable had been declared official policy. The invincible shield of the Inquisition had been shattered by a secular emperor. What happens when a system built on absolute certainty meets an army that does not believe in its power? This external shock was compounded by a deeper internal rot. The ideas of the European Enlightenment, which the Inquisition had worked so hard to keep beyond Spain's borders, had finally seeped through. A new generation of Spanish liberals, educated in principles of individual rights and freedom of conscience, began to openly question the institution's very existence. They argued in newspapers and political clubs that a modern nation could not thrive with a medieval court policing the thoughts of its citizens. The Inquisition was no longer just a religious matter, it was a political one, a relic holding Spain back from joining the community of progressive nations. Its methods, once accepted as normal, now seemed barbaric to an evolving moral sensibility. The world had changed, but the Inquisition had not. its obsession with doctrinal purity felt increasingly irrelevant in a century grappling with industrialization, constitutional monarchies, and the rights of man. How do you sustain an economy of fear when people are no longer afraid of the same old ghosts? The final death knell was political. After the defeat of Napoleon, the restored Spanish monarchy briefly brought the Inquisition back, but its authority was a pale shadow. It was a ghost haunting its own halls. The rise of liberal factions in the Spanish government created a permanent power struggle, and the Inquisition became a symbolic battleground. To the liberals, it was the ultimate symbol of everything they fought against: absolutism and obscurantism. Its continued existence was an embarrassment, a stubborn stain on Spain's international reputation. The internal pressure became too great. On July 15, 1834, a royal decree signed by the regent Maria Cristina formally and permanently abolished the Spanish Inquisition. The document was a dry, administrative piece of paper, a far cry from the dramatic autos de fe that had once dominated public life. The sprawling bureaucracy that had terrorized millions was dissolved with the stroke of a pen. Its vast properties were seized by the state, its prisons emptied, and its employees dismissed. The great machine of control was simply switched off. But what of its memory, the millions of pages of testimony and terror it had generated? The fate of its archives is a story in itself. The meticulous records, the very proof of its power, were not destroyed. They were bundled up and forgotten, transferred to state archives where they gathered dust for decades. They were considered an embarrassment, a dark chapter best left unread. It was only much later that historians would recognize their value, not as tools of persecution, but as keys to understanding the lives, fears, and resilience of ordinary people. The silence that followed its abolition was not just an absence of sound, but a collective national sigh of relief mixed with a determined effort to forget. The story of the Spanish Inquisition teaches us a final, crucial lesson. No system of control, no matter how deeply entrenched or terrifying, is truly permanent. It can be dismantled by new ideas, by external forces, and by the simple, slow passage of time. The walls that seem to have ears can, one day, be made to listen only to the echoes of their own departed power. So we have seen the machinery from every angle, from the throne room to the prison cell. The Spanish Inquisition was never a simple story of religious zeal. It was a complex, state-built engine designed for multiple, hidden purposes. It centralized royal power, breaking the influence of nobles and the church to make the monarchy the undisputed authority. It functioned as a ruthless economic machine, funding the empire by systematically plundering its most prosperous subjects. It engineered a new society through the toxic doctrine of blood purity, creating a rigid caste system that stifled talent and fostered division. It censored knowledge and art, building a wall around the Spanish mind to prevent the contagion of new ideas. And it weaponized paranoia, allowing political and personal vendettas to be settled under the holy cloak of orthodoxy. Each of these agendas reveals the same core truth. This was not a religious purge. It was a multi-purpose tool of absolute state control, a blueprint for power that proved terrifyingly effective for 3.5 centuries. Its long shadow forces us to confront a timeless danger, the threat of any institution that wields unchecked power while claiming a monopoly on truth or purity. When the pursuit of an ideal becomes an excuse for oppression, the result is always the same, a legacy of fear that echoes through the ages. We would love to hear which of these hidden agendas surprised you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into history's secrets, subscribe for more mysteries uncovered.